So I'm very proud to present here Angela. Angela is our community organizer with the Los Angeles Eco Village Institute. You might have also seen her as part of the Sunrise Movement in LA or the Public Bank in LA. She is very highly educated in very fun things like urban studies and has spent time researching eco developments in China and Tanzania. And so we're really happy to have her tell us about her time at the COP26.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna switch to my presentation. Okay, so today I want to talk a little bit about my travels to Glasgow, Scotland, and report back a little bit from COP26, which happened a couple of months ago. I was very fortunate to be able to attend this conference with a friend whom I met doing youth organizing work for the Sunrise Movement, which is a US-based youth movement fighting for climate justice. And so we both had really meaningful experiences and overall a really good time. There's so much information and so many feelings that have come from this COP, not just from me personally, but from everybody who was following it to some degree. So it's going to be impossible to cover everything in the time that we have today. So today what I just want to do is to give you a sense of where we are right now in solving the climate crisis based on this international conference, and to give some emotional color to things that were happening in the climate movement around COP, and to orient us all a little bit towards the future in this first month of 2022. So to begin, COP26 is the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference. It took place in Glasgow, Scotland. That is a map showing where it is. This is a meeting of all nations that are parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this meeting typically happens once a year. And if you're a party to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, it means that you as a country have agreed to participate in international efforts to address climate change in some way. And currently, most of the world's countries are parties to the convention. And then just a little bit of history, the first COP was held in Germany in 1995. And a lot of the major international climate change agreements that you've probably heard about, like the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, they were signed at COPs. And so not only is the COP an opportunity for world leaders to meet, to assess the current climate crisis and sign agreements that would address the crisis in some way, it's also an opportunity for observers to hold negotiating parties accountable, as well as to increase visibility internationally for this issue. So I'll speak a little bit about both sides. I'll talk a bit about like big picture accomplishments that came out of this COP, but also reflect a little bit about my personal experiences being an observer and an activist here. So the overall tenor of the conclusions of COP26 was very mixed. There was disappointment, there was frustration, but there was also triumph and a lot of breakthroughs. So I'll go over some of the major accomplishments and then also talk a little bit about why activists were disappointed about those conclusions. So where are we in terms of global temperature rise? So last year in August 2021, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a United Nations body of climate scientists, published the first part of its 6 major assessment report. So this report is shifting focus from 2 degrees Celsius of global warming compared to pre-industrial levels to 1.5 degrees. So basically, before we had thought that 2 degrees of warming would be bad, but tolerable. But now the science is telling us that 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming is pretty much the threshold that we need to pay attention to, because beyond that, climate disasters and widespread poverty are going to be the norm. And then a lot of devastating effects are going to be irreversible. So this COP specifically was oriented towards limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And to keep 1.5 degrees alive, we need to cut global greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030. And there's already analysis showing that the plans that nations have submitted at the end of COP are not enough to do that. Many countries that have a big greenhouse gas footprint have pledged to be net zero by 2050. And this would keep warming to around 1.8 or 1.9 degrees. But just in light of the shift to 1.5 degrees, the agreements that were reached at COP26 is asking countries that have not pledged to be net zero emissions by 2050 to make that pledge, as well as including direct language to resolve to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. So now there's that focus on that temperature threshold, which is good. So one thing that is related to limiting that temperature threshold is fossil fuel emissions. And this is a major thing in that for the first time ever, the text of a decision coming out of a COP included any mention of a fossil fuel, which is coal. And this happened in the paragraph calling for parties to phase down the unabated use of coal power and to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. So on the one hand, this is a big win in the way that fossil fuels are being acknowledged for the first time ever. But the language has been watered down from originally it was to phase out coal. But then nations sort of like negotiated for it to be phased down instead. And this has become a big pressure point with a lot of international activists. But even though that is the case, it's still great to have some concrete reduction targets for fossil fuels. And then another similar milestone in that vein is that after 5 years of negotiations, the rules for an international carbon market were finally decided on. So this would start allowing countries and private companies to buy and sell carbon emission permits. So for example, if you're a country that's doing well on keeping your emissions low, you can sell your unused permits to a country that is a bit behind in that goal. So this could incentivize carbon reductions and lead to investments in renewable energy. However, activists are saying that carbon markets ultimately still represent a really capitalist and extractivist view of the climate crisis. And at the same time, a carbon market doesn't really consider the harms of carbon emissions to local communities. Another concept that is now receiving a lot of attention is loss and damages, which is the acknowledgement that climate change has already caused irreparable loss, especially in a lot of the developing nations, and that as a result, they deserve to be compensated by nations that have historically played a bigger part in causing the climate crisis. So there is the recognition that at the Copenhagen COP, which happened in 2009, COP15, a bunch of nations pledged $100 billion to developing nations for climate finance, and essentially for like investing in developing nations to develop their carbon reduction mechanisms. So none of that money, even though it's been pledged, has been actually funneled to those countries. So that's something that people are angry about. But finally, with this recognition of loss and damages, people are starting to say, okay, like how can we start to actually move this money? And so that movement is quite promising. And some of the other historic pledges that happened include the Global Methane Pledge, which was officially launched at COP26 between the US and EU to reduce methane emissions by 30% by 2030. Another thing is the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forests and Land Use, which gathered 105 countries to pledge to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030. And then another nice pledge that happened was a group of 20 countries signed a pledge to end overseas financing projects of fossil fuels by the end of 2022. So yeah, definitely a lot of progress, but definitely still a lot more work to be done. Even as someone who was there inside the venue, it was like hard to see the big picture of like everything that I just described. I went to the COP as an observer, which meant that I had a badge to enter the event space and to sit on certain meetings and certain negotiations. And actually one of the first things that happened to me inside the COP event space was running into President Obama and John Kerry as they were walking from one meeting to another. So like I was at the heart of all the action. But even then I wasn't allowed to sit in on certain like top meetings where those decisions were being made. So instead I spent a lot of time with climate activists all over the world, either inside the venue or outside. And I want to share a bit about the energy that space held. So being inside the official venue was quite jarring because on the one hand, I was only able to listen in on tiny tidbits of the most monumental decisions that were happening. My friend sat in on a meeting where I think at least for an hour, everything that was discussed was whether to use the word should or shall, which like at the end was an important discussion about the wording, but in the moment it can just feel very sluggish and very bureaucratic. There were other events inside the venue like this one, which was a panel about the importance of women in leadership in developing nations. And so between my friend and me, we saw a lot of Indigenous and frontline activists inside the venue, and we could tell because they were either wearing their traditional clothing or performing traditional rituals, which is another like different thing that I could get into. So we actually did see a lot of talk about climate justice and centering Indigenous and marginalized communities inside the COP. So there was a lot of attention on making the right people visible, which ended up like being especially jarring because we now know that the conclusions that were signed didn't really measure up to what these activists were asking for. This is a picture of the American Pavilion at the, it was like kind of an exhibition space. It was like a gigantic trade show. So I listened in on this talk with like a bunch of governors and mayors of small cities, which was quite cool. I also sat in on a panel about sustainable building and heard industry experts talk about the importance of revolutionizing the building industry. And one thing that I noticed here was that the Q&A was dominated by this guy from the Concrete and Cement Association, which was interesting because concrete is actually one of the most carbon intensive building materials. So that was only one instance of how business interests really infiltrated the COP. And then another way that manifested was that there were 503 fossil fuel lobbyists inside the COP, like they were delegates. And so if they were considered all one country, they would be the biggest delegate of the COP. And they would be bigger than the combined delegations of the 8 countries that are most affected by climate change. So there you go. So lots of climate activists already knew that like COP can be a very greenwashed space, a very performative space. So every single day on the route into the venue, there were just like crowds of activists doing all kinds of actions. And these were just so colorful and so loud. There was a guy dressed as Darth Vader dancing every day. So many drum circles. This picture is a die-in that I saw on the last day of the COP. And basically they were trying to remind all the delegates of like people who had already died as a direct result of climate change. And it was, yeah, really powerful to see. So at the same time that the official COP was happening, a parallel movement was happening alongside it. It's called the COP26 Coalition. And it formed because it knew that COP26 is already upholding a lot of the systemic injustices that contributed to the climate crisis. And they knew that a lot of like people who were important, whose voices are important, wouldn't even be allowed into the COP because of vaccine issues and visa issues and etc. So it gathered activists from all over the world to hold their own event, which was a week-long summit focused on climate justice. And a highlight of this summit was an international day of action that called on people all over the world to have a march. So I joined the march that happened in Glasgow, which drew about 100,000 people into the streets. And I actually want to read a tidbit of the call to action of the day of action. So it says, "Justice won't be handed to us by world leaders or delivered by corporations. Only we can imagine and build the future that works for all of us. The transformative solutions that we need to survive and build a more just and fair world can only be brought about through collective action, solidarity, and coordination from our local communities and international levels." So the march was like really embodying all of that. It drew people from different coalitions, including political groups, faith-based groups, youth groups like Fridays for Future. Actually, there was a march like the day before with Greta Thunberg that I missed that one. Local activist groups like Extinction Rebellion was a huge presence. And then like, so nice to see just a lot of people showing up either by themselves or with friends and family. This was a picture that I took with the Youth Communist League, and then just standing there with like a really heavy police presence, which was, yeah, hard to describe like my feelings seeing this. Personally, my one of the most poignant moments for me in this march was seeing this delegation from the Pacific Islands Climate Action Network marching with their flags and their national dress and just like the most triumphant music. And that is saying that they are here to fight. They are fighting for their lives, but also they're fighting for their joy. And they are not backing down. And I think joy was a huge part of the People's Summit. There was like a ton of events, ton of talks where people just shared knowledge with each other. I learned so much about the global grassroots movement calling for climate justice and all the issues that intersect with it. I represented Sunrise Movement and met climate activists from all over the world. And so I feel really excited about continuing to collaborate with them on international actions and letting them know about the local things that we're doing, like our work with the LA Eco Village. And yeah, so I think overall there were definitely just moments that of this week that I just was in tears, either out of frustration or anger or hope, which yeah, there was plenty of all of that. But I want to end with a note looking towards the future. So I want to share about one moment that really brought me a lot of emotions and hope. So that was, so as part of the People Summit, I went to a workshop which was called Tales of Transformation, Working with Narratives for Climate Just Futures. And so basically from this COP, we are seeing that even though there was some progress, the work that international leaders are doing is not enough. And there's so much to be done and done well by frontline activists and grassroots groups and people like you and me. And I think a big part of that important work is changing the dominant narrative about climate change to start telling each other different and better stories about our future. So at this workshop, we were asked some questions about how we can be changing that narrative. How can we be transforming what we think about the climate crisis and our personal responsibilities in order to kind of tell those better stories? So I'm gonna bring you the same questions that were asked and invite you to reflect on them and also to invite you, if you wish, to bring those questions back to your communities for like collective reflection as well. So here are the questions and I will read them out loud. And then afterwards, I'd love to open a space for discussion, questions, reflection. And yeah, so let's imagine a world where climate change and environmental degradation have been overcome. What would it feel like to live in such a world? What would we value in such a world? What are personal and shared responsibilities in such a world? And how can people contribute to the emergence and maintenance of such a world? So thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela, for sharing your experiences with us. That was very interesting and fascinating for those of us who couldn't be there. And it seems to be an experience from all over the place, like you said, from like, you know, frustrations to joy, to seeing how other people have been put together. And so, yeah, let's open this up for people to share their thoughts and reflections and see if they have any questions for you.